Hi skiers, I'm Jeff from skiessentials.com. Welcome to our first ever binding comparison. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. This is something that you guys have been asking about for a while. We've really wanted to get to it, and finally here we are. I don't even know how many bindings are in front of me, but a lot. And what we're going to do is we're going to run through them from the bindings over here on your left to the bindings over here on your right. And pretty much just talk about kind of some highlighting features of each one of them, what type of skiers each binding is going to be best for. What we won't really be doing is going super in-depth about like the engineering, the technology, like why, ramp angles, stuff like that. We won't be going super technical. My concern, if we did go really technical, is this video would end up being like 4 hours long or something ridiculous. So as we're going through these bindings, maybe make a note to yourself if there's one that you want to learn more about, or if you have a specific question about a binding up here that we don't cover, drop it in the comments. If there's something that you want us to do like a longer in-depth review of, drop that in the comments as well. We are planning on doing some more in-depth binding reviews where we would have more time to go into, all the specific materials used, all the technology and stuff like that. This is more intended to be a guide for somebody who's kind of unsure about selecting a binding. And hopefully this gives you a sense of what among these bindings would work for you, what might not be enough binding, what might be a little bit too much binding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So keep that in mind. If you have any questions, let us know, or if you want to know, if you would like to see us do like a deeper dive into one of these bindings. A couple of them we have already, most of them we have not. So that said, before we start, let's just kind of talk about a few things in general. Before you're selecting a pair of bindings, I think it's pretty important to do kind of a self-assessment period. There is a big chunk of these bindings that is going to be really appropriate for, like, I'd say 80 to even 90% of skiers out there. And then as we move up, kind of like the second half of this video roughly, those bindings realistically are intended and designed more for like 10 to 20% of all skiers in the world, and in some situations less. So choosing a binding is kind of a tricky thing. It's somewhat like choosing a ski, but you can kind of do yourself a disservice by getting a binding that, for example, is maybe too heavy for you. Or you might not even fall into the DIN range of a more expensive binding. So it's not exactly like shopping for like a mountain bike, where the more money you spend, the better your experience is going to be, like flat out across the board. It's not as simple with bindings. You can't just... Any skier in the world can't just buy the most expensive binding thinking that they're going to get the best performance for them. So self-assessment is really important. You should at least be aware of where your DIN setting is, or a range of where you like your DIN setting to fall. If you're not sure about that stuff, check with a local shop. Give us a call. You could even just leave a comment with your stats, and I'll let you know where your DIN falls. So I think that's all the information that I wanted to get out before we jump into the bindings themselves. I did leave myself some notes on weights and stuff like that, because I did not think I would be able to remember the weights of all these skis. So if you see me checking the floor over there, I'm just checking weights. So that said, let's get right into it. These four bindings over here to my right are really good bindings for lighter weight skiers, less aggressive skiers. A lot of women choose these bindings. A lot of teenagers choose these bindings. I coach part-time youth freestyle and freeride programs. A lot of the kids, as they're kind of growing up through the tween and young teenage years, they often choose these bindings as well. So over here, this is the Marker 10.0 TP. This is the least expensive binding we have up here. It's $129. Really, really lightweight performance. It's 1,518 grams. So the lightest binding we have up here just by a little bit. And pretty simplistic design. You know, it's a 3 to 10 din range. There's not much metal used in this binding. Pretty similar toe piece to what we see in like some Marker Royal Family bindings, but a little bit different. And a great binding if you're not super demanding on your equipment, you're not skiing super aggressively, you just want something affordable and lightweight. The next binding that we're going to talk about is the Attack 11 from Tyrolia, which is very, very similar to that 10.0 TP over there. This does jump up to an 11 din range, and it is a slightly stronger binding. It's a little heavier. The stat that I have written down is 1,550 grams, but I'm 100% sure that's without the brake. So it is heavier than that 10.0 TP, but a really, really good binding for a similar skier, but somebody who maybe is like the next step up in either your size, either you're an adult, like a full-grown adult, and you want a slightly stronger binding, or somebody who's a little bit more aggressive. What's really cool about the Attacks in general is they have really low stand height, and they're also really wide. So I'll use the toe piece as an example. That's how much you're getting picked up off the ski. I think it's like 17 millimeters total, which is really, really low. You don't get too much lower than that in any binding. So low stand height and a really wide platform, which works really well on wider skis. So if you're kind of in that lighter intermediate range, you know, you don't need a super burly binding, but you have a wider ski and you want a really good binding for that ski, that Attack 11 is really cool. Now, the next binding is the Marker Squire. Marker Squire has been around for a really long time, and in a lot of ways, it's very, very similar to that Attack 11. A little bit lighter here at just 1,530 grams. That's including the brake. It is like kind of, I think the highlight of the Squire is how light it is. Now, I also think this is kind of like the easiest to outgrow. This is a binding that I see a lot of the kids I coach use, and then a lot of lighter weight women. And I think as soon as you get into like the 140, 150 pound range, even if you're not super aggressive, it might be better bumping up to the Griffon, which we're going to talk about shortly. So that said, this is a really good binding for a lighter weight skier who wants to keep their whole equipment package as light as they can. And similar stand height to the Attack, a little bit taller. I don't think a ton of skiers are going to notice the difference in stand height when you're at this level and you're at this kind of ability level of skier. You probably won't notice a huge difference in stand height between something like the Attack and the Squire, but it is worth noting. But kind of a step up in performance from that 10.0 TP. The Squire is up to 189. That Attack was at 169. So we're stepping up in price, and we're also stepping up in functionality and overall performance. And then this Warden 11, to me, this is kind of another step up. We're still in that 11 din range, and it's not necessarily that this binding would always outperform those bindings, but it's a little heavier. This Warden is coming in at 1,860 grams, so a little bit heavier, and I do feel like this toe piece has some benefits. So, you know, maybe you're a little bit above that weight range that I described for the Squire, which I'm being more conservative than Marker. Marker would put their weight range, I think, up to like a 200-pound skier, but I'm not sure that's the best choice. I do think a heavier skier can use this Warden 11. Really good binding, again, the same as all of these bindings that we're starting with, relatively intermediate level skier, but then like an advanced lady could use this. My girlfriend skis this binding and she loves it. And something that's really cool about these bindings that's not true all the way through is that they're multi-norm compatible. So you can use this binding with a touring sole. Pretty much the 10.0 TP and the Attack, those will take an Alpine sole and a grip walk sole. The Squire, the newest version of the Squire, will take a touring sole as well. But something to keep in mind if you're choosing these bindings, if you have a rockered touring sole, you have limited options among this group. But overall, this table right here, really good for lighter weight skiers, less aggressive skiers. A lot of women choose these bindings, a lot of teenagers. I've put plenty of younger athletes on very similar bindings to over here, and they work really, really well. Now, the next kind of grouping of bindings that we're going to look at, which really includes four, arguably five bindings, to me, we're really getting into the bread and butter of ski bindings in general. These next two in particular, we sell more of these than any other binding at Ski Essentials. I'm pretty darn sure these are the two best-selling bindings on the market, although don't quote me on that because I could be wrong. But between these four bindings and the next 4 or 5 bindings that we're going to look at, to me, that does cover the vast majority of skiers. That's what I'm talking about when I say like 80 to 90% of skiers, these are plenty of binding. And that first one that I want to talk about is the Tyrolia Attack 13. So a little bit of a step up from the Attack 11 to this Attack 13, most notably in the heel piece. This has the NXFR heel as opposed to the SXFR heel in the 11. So a little stronger spring, a little bit just stronger housing in general, but the weight goes up too. So we're moving into the 2,000 plus gram range for pretty much the rest of these bindings until we get over here to the left. But yeah, this Attack 13 is 2,070 grams, which is relatively light, and just provides like really good performance for a huge majority of skiers. Like I said to start, there's not many skiers that are gonna push this past its limits, and everything that I was saying about the Attack 11 kind of carries over to this Attack 13 as well. So really, really low stand height. And a nice wide platform. I love the way that these bindings feel on wider skis. There is something to be said about like power transmission from a wider platform like this to a wider ski. And I personally am somebody who likes to have kind of the lowest stand height possible. And that is something that the Attack achieves really nicely. Now, the next binding is the marker Griffon, which this thing is a classic. It's been around for a really long time. Between the Attack 13 and the Griffon, I probably sound like a broken record, but we're covering a huge range in skiers here. You see these bindings on more of our packages, the ski and binding combination packages on our site than anything else. They're affordable. That Attack 13 is $199. The Griffon we bump up to $229, but really good all mountain binding, very, very versatile, pretty wide, not as wide as the Attack, but pretty wide. Reasonable stand height. This one will now take a touring sole, which is pretty darn cool. And it's a proven binding. Now, something that's kind of interesting about the Attack versus the Griffon is the heel piece. This is a single pivot heel piece, which has actually been updated. The whole Griffon and the Jester has been updated for 2021. So single pivot heel piece. What this does is it's positioning the spring vertically, like a downward motion onto your heel piece. Some skiers really, really like that feel, and there's also more elastic travel in the heel piece of the marker compared to the Attack. So if you're the type of person that gets kind of nitty-gritty details about elastic travel and stuff like that, the marker heel piece is pretty darn good, and it's similar to what we're going to see in some other options. The downside to this heel piece, and it's something that marker has improved for 2021, but it still is a difference, they're harder to click into. Which seems like a kind of trivial difference, but there are situations like if you're in really deep, soft snow, where traditionally the Griffon has been kind of tricky to click into, especially if you're at a higher din. So different feel in those heel pieces, although the resulting performance is pretty darn similar. Next binding we're going to look at is the Warden 13. So like we talked about the Warden 11, really the same differences between, something like the Squire and the Attack 11 and the Warden 11 between the Attack 13, the Griffon, and this binding. So a slightly higher stand height, multi-norm compatible. This heel piece is more similar to what we see from Tyrolia. The toe piece is kind of it's similar to what we see in the STH series, the Salomon STH series, which regrettably is the only binding that we didn't have in stock that I really wanted to include in this comparison. You get a good amount of elastic travel out of these wings. And yeah, if I didn't already say it, multi-norm compatible. So Warden's a great option if you're looking for something that'll work with a rockered touring sole, new Griffon as well. And that Warden jumps up to $269. So a bit of a jump up in price there, but it's a really cool binding, and it's got that toe piece in particular has a really solid feel, the way that the wings kind of wrap around you a little more than most toe pieces. Not quite as much as an STH, which is arguably one of the coolest toe pieces out there, but yeah, pretty darn good. Next binding is the Look SPX12. I really like this binding. Big fan of Look bindings in general. This heel piece is very, very similar to what we just saw in the Griffon. There's a lot of elastic travel in here. This toe piece is pretty cool because it's got 180 degrees of release. There's vertical release in this, which is kind of unique. These wings act independently from each other in a different way than, say, I guess really any of the toe pieces that we've looked at so far, because the wings are basically the entire connectivity to your boot. The release is a little different, and that's something that's I think Look is proud of is their releasability out of the toe. And yeah, really, and just like I said about those last three bindings, really good option for a wide range of skiers. I personally kind of like the way that Look bindings feel a little bit lower profile in a lot of sense, which we're going to talk about when we get to these. But realistically, among those last four bindings, it's kind of personal preference. It's pretty, I've skied all of those bindings back to back. A lot of those bindings are used as demo bindings. They have an adjustable demo version of them. So when we're out testing skis, chances are we're on a binding like that. And truth be told, I don't notice a drastic difference among them. They all feel really solid. I can ski them pretty darn aggressively and not worry about releasing, anything like that. Now moving on, this next binding is the Attack 14 AT, which we've talked about. Compatibility with rockered touring soles. If you want an Attack and you have a rockered touring sole, you kind of need to get this Attack 14 AT. It's just the design is a little bit different. This toe height is adjustable, which is kind of required when you're going to be compatible with a rockered touring sole. So that makes the stand height a little bit higher on this binding, and the price goes up a little bit as well to $249. So realistically, they're basically exactly the same as the Attack 13, but I think it's a valuable one to have in this video because it has touring sole compatibility. So that said, that kind of concludes what I think is the bulk of the binding market. That covers a huge range of skiers. When I'm riding the lift, looking down at the skiers below me, 90% of those people I would feel 100% confident putting on any one of those bindings, depending on weight and stuff like that. But realistically, if you're shopping for an all-mountain ski and you're shopping for a binding to go with it, that's probably where you should start. Now, if you're a more aggressive skier, if you're more demanding on your equipment, if you've had issues with those bindings, like realistically that you shouldn't have issues with those bindings, but there are situations where somebody will push them past their limits, or maybe you're not actually going to push them to that threshold of not being safe, but you don't even want to have to worry about that. That's also a perfectly reasonable thing to thing to think about, and then move up to like kind of the next range in bindings. And to start that next range in bindings, I'd like to talk about the Jester first. So take everything that we said about the Griffon. This binding is basically exactly the same. So where's the Griffon? These toe pieces are pretty much identical design. You know, they're the same exact shape. Same thing with the heel pieces. These heel pieces are the same. Now, the difference here is that you get a stronger spring, so you get a higher din range. You get a 6 to 16 din range in the Jester, and you also get different materials, and that's kind of the big thing when you're jumping up from that 13 din range to anything above that, is the materials used in the binding are going to be stronger. So take these wings that hold the heel piece onto the track, basically, which we don't have with us right now. But these 4 wings all kind of attach to the track that the heel piece sits on. These wings are magnesium. The wings in the Griffon are plastic. Now, magnesium is obviously stronger than plastic, and I think while we're right here, we can talk about the Jester Pro too, because it's basically the same binding. You just jump up to 8 to 18. So magnesium is stronger than plastic. Now, that said, the weight is different. So the Jester jumps up to 2,140 grams, where the Griffon is 2,040. So you go up a significant amount in weight. You know, even just holding these 2 toe pieces, or these 2 heel pieces, this feels heavier. So that's kind of where I was going at the beginning of this video when I talked about the fact that, like, you can't just spend more money on bindings and get something that's more appropriate to you. If you're a skier that has no risk whatsoever of potentially breaking this heel piece, then there's no point in having a heavier binding. I feel pretty strongly about that, which it goes back to that kind of self-assessment thing, is you have to think about yourself as a skier and what you need and whether it's worth getting a heavier binding to kind of achieve that. This is the Attack 16. Same story. You know, everything that we said about the Attack 13 holds true to this 16. The design is basically the same. Twin cam heel piece, you know, the spring is positioned on the same axis and all that. It's the same design toe piece. The difference is there's more metal in this binding housing. It's a little bit more trustworthy if you're doing crazy things on skis. I was a competitive slopestyle athlete for a long time. I used the Attack 16 for many years. I used the Jester Pro for many years. I used the Pivot 18 for many years. In situations like that, I did not want to have to worry about a binding failing, like 100% failing from like landing switch on like an 80-foot park jump or something like that. But these are really specific applications. So going back to that self-assessment, take a moment to kind of think about yourself as a skier and whether you need that stuff. This binding right here, this is the Marker XComp Race 18. Really cool binding, pretty much the same as the XL that we've been getting for years and years and years. This one I thought was interesting to throw in here because it's really heavy. It's 2,600 grams, and it's actually designed for a more specific application than a lot of these other bindings. This is more intended for a race ski, which is part of the reason why it's so heavy. 2,600 grams is heavy, but when you are on a race ski or a dedicated carving ski, weight isn't like a huge issue. So you can kind of justify going with a slightly heavier binding. You know, you're not worried about like quickness, about like smearing or pivoting quickness. You're less concerned about how fatiguing something is because you don't have to like do quick maneuvering movements. That's a really cool binding. But yeah, that weight is noticeable. And then this also jumps up to $309. Let's see, Jester's at $359. We kind of glossed over this. Jester Pro is at $429. Attack 16 is at $349. So similar range in prices there. You might be looking in a higher end binding, and you might be like tempted by something like this, but keep in mind that it's heavier and it's designed more for a specific thing. All right, and that moves us through most of the bindings here, kind of leaving some pretty cool ones to end with. The first being this Look Pivot 14. Now, in the Pivot 14, we're going to kind of group these two bindings together, but let's start with the 14. You basically get the same toe piece as the SPX. So you get those same wings that we talked about that kind of act independently of each other but come together to form the entire toe piece. You get the same 180 degrees of release out of the toe. Now, this heel piece is quite a bit different, and you'll see people talking about this heel piece. You'll see this heel piece on snow a lot. If you looked at the post we did yesterday, somebody said, like, this is the best binding, you can forget about everything else. You will see a lot of that, and there are reasons why, but as with everything, it's that self-assessment that you have to go back to, and is this right for you? That's something that you have to decide. Is a pivot the best choice for every skier out there? Absolutely not. I think that's fair and safe to say. I'll kind of use my girlfriend as an example again. I don't think I would put her on a pivot. There's some user friendliness to it that's can be more challenging for some skiers. There are performance benefits to it that not everyone's going to feel or need. But that said, it's a cool binding, and let's talk about why. So most notably, this 360 degrees of rotation is really quite unique. You're not going to see any other binding that turns completely around. This is known as the turntable heel, and it's pretty iconic. Now, what makes it cool is it releases very consistently, and it releases in a lot of different ways. So because this is able to kind of spin all the way around, it releases in what looks as 360 degrees. There are some people who think this is like the safest binding on the market. I wouldn't go as far as saying that. I've torque tested like every single binding up here, and they all release within the intended release specs. So I wouldn't go quite that far. But what's really cool about this binding is its elastic travel, and especially in the heel piece. So it will keep you into your skis longer than most bindings up here. Now, if you think about like the skier type thing, when you're getting your skis mounted or you're demoing skis and they say, hey, are you a type 1, type 2, or type 3, or type 3 plus skier? A type 3 skier, by definition, is somebody who prefers their skis to stay on their feet in the event of a fall. A type 1 skier is somebody who wants their skis to release. Now, that's where this binding kind of comes into play. If you're a type 3 skier and you prefer in most situations for your skis to stay on, I think pivots are really good. The other benefit of pivots is the short drill pattern. So if you can imagine a boot kind of clicked into these, the furthest back screws in this binding are right here. So about 2 inches before the actual back of your boot. Now, if we compare it to, even another binding from Look, this SPX heel, the furthest back screw is all the way back there to that finger where the back of your boot is right there. So when you're drilling a binding into a ski, you're kind of creating this platform. And because the pivot has a shorter drill pattern, the platform itself is shorter. And because there's more elastic travel in this heel, it will allow the ski to flex a little bit more naturally underfoot. So those are kind of the reasons why you see a lot of people talking about the pivots. You see a lot of like high-level skiers or high-end skiers kind of swearing by this stuff. I will say personally, I have a lot of pivots on a lot of my skis. I think they feel great. But I'm also somebody who swore by this binding for a long time. I swore by the Attack 16 for a long time. I have 100% trust in all three of those bindings, as well as like the Salomon STH 16. I'm not so much of a pivot snob, which is a term that we like to throw around, that I would say it is drastically better than the rest of these bindings to the point where like they're obsolete or inferior. I don't feel that way at all. I do think for certain skiers there are performance benefits to the pivot and reasons to choose it, but I like all those other bindings as well. Now, the Pivot 18, I think this is like a pretty darn important one to talk about too. You get a full metal toe piece out of this Pivot 18, and they did just re-release the Pivot 15 as well if you don't fall into the 8 to 18 din range on the Pivot 18. Kind of like taking that to another level. If you're the type of skier who is really, really demanding on your equipment, you want something that is practically bomb-proof, and by that I mean you could throw this into a bomb and explode the bomb, and it would probably come out intact, or at least the metal housing would. This is a really good option. You don't get the same 180-degree release out of the toe. I think that is something that you need to keep in mind when you're considering a Pivot 18 or a Pivot 15. There aren't those wings, so you don't get the same vertical release and stuff like that. So kind of going a step further towards that, like, I'm the type of skier who would prefer my skis to stay on my feet type of thing. Now, those are pivots. Let us know if you have any questions about pivots compared to Jester Pros, compared to Attack 16s or whatever. I know just from reading the comments and communicating with you guys that we have a lot of pivot fans among our audience. So yeah, if you want to share your thoughts, if you're one of these skiers or another skier, or you've been on binding X and then you switched to binding Y and you felt this, let us know. I know other people really like reading that stuff as well. And then from there, we're going to move into some kind of more specific stuff, starting with this knee binding extreme, or I think that knee binding hardcore. I always thought this binding was called the extreme. Knee bindings are pretty darn cool. They're actually based here in Stowe as a company, and they've been around for a while. I was actually involved in some of the early prototype testing of these bindings back when I was part of the UVM freestyle ski team. These are intended to decrease knee injuries and specifically ACL tears. I'm not going to get into why that is, or like the engineering of why that happens. If you want to, knee binding has a ton of this information, and you could spend like hours kind of looking through different charts and stuff like that, and reading why this binding functions a little differently. There's more lateral release out of the toe, or out of the heel rather, and there's basically just more lateral release out of everything. This toe piece is pretty darn unique, in the sense that there's a single pivoting, it's one unit instead of wings. So if you're concerned about knee injuries, or if you're coming out of a knee surgery, I do think this is an interesting option. Something that I'd like to point out about this binding is the stand height is really high. It's almost like if you were to mount something like this on a race plate, which a lot of people take this binding and put it on a race plate. You're basically like achieving the same height as this binding on a race plate. So me personally, and I think it's fair to say a lot of skiers, especially skiers like me, prefer to have a lower stand height, lower center of gravity. But I do think the knee binding is a really cool choice for a carving ski. In fact, there are a lot of people here in Stowe that have this binding mounted on something like a Stokely Laser AR or a Stokely Laser AX or another one of those flat carving skis, because you don't have to put a race plate on them, and then you're still getting like a nice amount of leverage over the ski, which I think is kind of cool. But that's the knee binding. It's pretty darn unique. I would encourage you to read their information on it, because I don't want to get anything wrong. And it is like a pretty interesting thing. But if you're concerned about knee injuries, there's that option, and I think it's nice to have. Now, next up is the Salomon Shift, also the Armada Shift, also the Atomic Shift. All three of those brands now have their own shift. And this binding kind of changed the game a little bit. This is a hybrid alpine touring and resort binding. We have talked about this binding plenty. We did a full review on this binding, so if you want to know more about it, go check that out. But if you're looking for a binding that crosses over and performs well as an alpine touring binding and in the resort, these shifts are really good. They're also pretty darn light too. This 13 is 1,700 grams, and this 10 version is 1,370. And the 10 DIN version is new. The range is 4 to 10. It's new for 2021. Basically, there were a handful of skiers, or more than a handful of skiers, that didn't quite fall into the 6 to 13 DIN range of the Shift 13. Mostly lighter weight women, younger skiers, stuff like that. Usually it was people that had a 5 DIN that were like, what do I do? Now you have an option in this Shift 10, and it's quite a bit lighter too. Actually, the heel piece is like noticeably different, or at least it was the first time I lifted them up. But really good bindings. If you don't know about these bindings, there's plenty of information out there. Basically, it transitions from a binding that was designed based on that STH that we unfortunately don't have in this comparison. So you get Salomon's cool wings up here, and then it basically just transitions into a Pintech touring binding. So you get really, really efficient use on the uphill, efficient ascents, and then a strong binding for the descents as well. And like I said, this binding kind of like changed the game when it came out. Previously to that, we were using pretty much all frame bindings, and these ski way better. Remember when we were talking about how a pivot allows a ski to flex underfoot? This is the F12 Tour from Marker, which is still certainly a reasonable option for a touring binding, especially if you don't have a tech fit boot. If you don't have Pintech holes in the toe of your boot, this is a really good choice. The reason why we're moving away from stuff like this is the frame itself can provide kind of a dead spot on the ski. So instead of a binding like this, where the drill pattern's really short and then the elastic travel kind of allows the ski to flex, this big frame is kind of doing the opposite. It's basically stopping the ski from flexing underfoot. But it's a little bit more affordable. So this F12 Tour, I believe it's I didn't write it down. I think I'll flash it up on the screen. I think it's $429, where shifts were in the $549 and $599 range. And then now we have a new option from Marker, that being the Duke PT. And we have a Duke PT 12 and a Duke PT 16. Like the Shift, I'm not going to go through all the changes to how it operates. I find it easier to do that when it's actually drilled into a ski than just holding it in your hand. But we have a full review of this binding as well. So if you want to learn about all that stuff, how it works, how it functions, how you transition from alpine to touring mode, all that kind of stuff, take a look at those reviews. So the Duke PT, I think this is fair to say, it was designed kind of in response to the Shift, or maybe the development started before then, but that's how it felt. Because this is the first year for the Duke PT where the Shift has been around for a few years. Now, we get a 12 DIN version and a 16 DIN version. This is basically a Squire heel piece, and this is basically a Jester heel piece. So obviously, as we've learned, the 16 is going to be a little stronger than the 12 DIN version, but also a little bit heavier. So back to that self-assessment period, you kind of have to ask yourself, if you're interested in these two bindings, do I need the extra strength of this heel piece, or will a 12 be just fine? And, basically what you're weighing, no pun intended, is the weight. So this 12 is 2,300 grams in this is both in alpine mode, and this is 2,700 grams in alpine mode. So 400 grams heavier over here in the 16, but you do get a stronger heel piece. Now, these are a little different in the way that they kind of transition from alpine mode to touring mode. In the Marker, you can take this whole toe piece off, and there's kind of like another binding under there. The Shift kind of just it's like a transformer. It transforms from alpine binding to tech fit binding in the way that it kind of folds, and then other things pop out and other things pop in. This, you're basically just taking off this toe piece in the front, and you're revealing what's basically like a Dynafit toe. I think it is perfectly fair, and I don't think anybody from Salomon would argue with me or is going to send me a nasty email for saying this. If you're looking for a hybrid resort alpine touring binding and you're like the most aggressive skier on the world or in the world, this is the strongest alpine touring binding of this design. If you think back to like the Duke frame binding, that was always kind of known as one of the strongest bindings, along with the Guardian 16, that was a Salomon atomic binding, or the Tracker 16. Those were kind of the upper echelon, which makes sense because they share this 16 DIN range. This is a stronger overall binding than the Shift, but it's quite a bit heavier. So that Shift 13 was 1,700 grams, and this is 2,700 grams. So that's 1,000 grams heavier in alpine mode, which is a significant difference. So you kind of like, I've said this so many times throughout this comparison, but it goes back to self-assessment. So like, are you hitting 100-foot backcountry jumps? Are you dropping 50-foot cliffs in the backcountry? If the answers to those questions are yes, you might consider going with this. Now, that said, I've seen people do those things on shifts and get away with it just fine, but this is going to be a little bit stronger. So if you're really looking for that, the strongest possible touring binding you can get, and you're not concerned about weight at all, that is, I do think it's stronger than the Shift. Now, I'll admit, I have both. I have a Shift 13 on a slightly lighter pair of skis, and then I have a Duke PT16 on a pair of skis that's like kind of huge and already pretty heavy, and I didn't care about how light the bindings were going to be on that ski. In my mind, I was like, maybe I'll get to go heli skiing or touring in Alaska someday, and like this will be the ski that I bring. But for here in Stowe, I use my setup with the Shift more often just because I usually value having a slightly lighter binding. So it all goes back to self-assessment, personal preference, and kind of choosing what's right for you. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that was plenty long. I'm hoping I didn't bore you guys or just tell you a bunch of things you already knew about these bindings. I have learned over the past week that a binding comparison is a fairly challenging thing to do. And like I said at the beginning, we could have spent like 3 hours going through all these bindings and talking about the difference in how many engagement points they have, the exact stand height of every single binding. That's the kind of stuff that you can find. All those stats are out there. I didn't think we needed to really go that deep, and hopefully I'm not wrong, and hopefully you got a sense of, among these bindings, what would be best for you as a skier. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Leave a comment right here on YouTube or right here on the article if you're reading the written article on Chairlift Chat. Please don't hesitate to do so. I would say among our staff, we have skied easily every single binding on this or in this comparison, and just even me personally, I've probably skied 12 or 13 of them. So if you have any questions about how they feel, the differences in performance, the differences in feel, and we didn't touch on that in this video, please don't hesitate to leave a question, and we will get back to you as soon as we can, as we always do. And yeah, that's it. It's a ton of bindings, a lot to talk about. Hopefully you guys are getting out skiing. Christmas is in a few days, so happy holidays. Hopefully you guys are getting some time off for the holidays and can get on the slopes with family and friends and stuff like that. Stay safe, stay happy, stay positive. Still kind of COVID ski season here in Vermont as it is everywhere else. So we'll see you guys out there on the slopes, and once again, happy holidays.